Hey, OncoPT, and welcome back to this episode of the OncoPT Podcast. You know her, you love her, she's back, y'all. And we are in the new year, and one of the things I really wanted to do is kind of reframe how the year's gonna go. At this time, like, we're into the new year solidly, and some of us may have forgotten our New Year's resolutions or not even made them all together, which is a trend that I'm hopping on for sure. But I think it's so important to carry with intention of how are we going to grow and continue to become the best possible version of ourselves for our patients so we can continue to show up in our own communities. And so I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Rebekah Griffith back on the OncoPT podcast today to talk about something that we very briefly got to enjoy learning from her at the Cancer Rehab Community Conference back in November. So Rebekah, welcome back to the OncoPT podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, but I'm already going to push back on you on the things you just said.
Tell me. I'm here for it.
I'm totally with you on this, like, no, new year, new you. But I think there's probably somebody listening who's burned out, who's really not excited about this new year. That they're going into the new year feeling a little hopeless. And like they do need a new year, new me, because where they're at right now feels unsustainable. So it's not about New Year's resolutions. It's about like getting your life back. And I would also say, I want you to be the best person you can be for yourself before you try to be the best person you can be for your patients. Because I think so often, especially as caregivers, I mean, and I'm a mom too, right? Like, there's all this pressure on, you can't pour from an empty cup. How are you supposed to take care of others if you don't take care of yourself? And all of this. But it's so hard to consistently say you need to be better for other people because then you're forgetting yourself. So I'm going to say, like, I want you to be the best person you can be for yourself. And then everything else will kind of flow from there.
I'm sure Rebekah knows this, but we've had conversations like this previously. And one of the things when we were preparing for the Cancer Rehab Community Conference is she said, every time I give this talk, someone cries. And it's usually also me. And she gave her presentation, and I was definitely like tearing up. Rebekah, I'm already tearing up a little bit. And we just started the interview.
Well, I know. And I saw this quote recently too that said, I know you would die for your child. Mm-hmm. But would you live for them? You only have to die one time, but you have to live every single day, and you have to make choices over and over and over again that really allow you to live and survive and thrive. So I want you to consider that for yourself as we go into this conversation. Will you choose to live for yourself in this new year and take care of yourself? So as you're thinking about like New Year's resolutions, it's not about losing 15 pounds. It's about will you and are you ready to live for yourself? And the last thing I'm going to say to like set the stage for that is that if you are burned out, it is not your fault. And you got to let that go before we have this conversation. I'm giving you permission to let that go.
I'm really glad you're starting with this because this is something I held a lot of shame around for a long time. So like, I started working at my dream job, and for the viewer of the video form, I'm doing in air quotations here. I started at my dream job, and it really was everything that I wanted after PT school. And when I started working there, it became a nightmare very quickly. And I was already burnt out, but didn't have the words for it before COVID. And then when COVID hit, it totally just revealed all of these cracks in like how unsustainable this position was for me. And I ended up leaving. And I kept that very close to me for a long time. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed that I couldn't handle it. I couldn't cut it. I couldn't be the physical therapist that I wanted to be or that I thought I wanted to be. And so like, I kind of, even on this platform, like I was just very like, well, we're just going to just shove that down and not talk about it. And I've grown since that, but I'm really, really glad that you are starting this conversation with that acknowledgement, Rebekah, because that is something like I have very personally experienced. And I bet there's someone out there who's listening who is there right now.
Well, and nightmares are a kind of dream, right? So you still had your dream job. It was just the wrong kind of dream. And I think the other thing about that, and the reason that I think you felt so kind of dismayed by that is because there was a conflict with yourself there, right? Like, I thought this was the thing for me. I don't know myself at all. And then how are you supposed to trust your judgment choosing the next thing for you because you were so wrong? You know, this was the dream. This was what you'd been working towards. And now you're like, I was so wrong. How am I supposed to even trust myself and make that next choice? So I think that's a huge part of why we get that shame, because our, like, what we thought we wanted and what we have, how things turn out to be, it feels like we can't really trust ourselves. And that's really hard.
Before we get any further into this, because I know we're going to get really deep really quickly, can we just define, like, what is the working definition of burnout that we're working with today? And then let's just, like, let's let this car roll, man.
Okay, so, like, if you Google it, there's so many definitions. And everybody also has a picture in their head. And we'll talk about that a little bit on Twitter, right? Like, what is burnout to me? What is burnout to you? But the definition that I like to start with is job burnout, because that's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about parenting burnout or whatever. Is a special type of work-related stress, a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and a loss of personal identity. And I feel like we work so hard to become physical therapists that when you get burned out being a physical therapist, then you have that whole Barbie moment with that song, What Was I Made For? If I'm not meant to be a physical therapist, who am I? And what do I do next? And what was all that for? And it makes you feel very out of control and very lost very fast and very guilty and ashamed. Now, I also looked a little bit into, like, a little bit further than that in the medical literature, and I found this, like, just lovely piece of literature from the American Journal of Psychiatry. And it's so lovely. It's so short, but it's lovely. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want you to read it. It basically, the premise is burnout is many things to different people. And this is primarily geared towards physicians, but it has these sections on what burnout is and what it isn't. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these. Burnout is a painful and lonely experience, often involving depersonalization, exhaustion, and a decreased sense of effectiveness that has an insidious onset and takes many physicians by surprise. And I think all of us maybe have had that moment where all of a sudden we're like, I don't even care anymore. You might be in the middle of working with a patient and you might have that thought. You're like, I cannot care. I don't know where the part of me that felt went, but it is gone. And that's scary, especially when it turns toward yourself.
Ooh, yeah.
And then burnout is a mismatch between expectations of work and actual experience, including the role of work in their lives and their work-life balance. Yeah. It involves the loss of meaning in work. There's an umbrella term, like it appears to be a risk factor for psychiatric problems. We're not going to go that far today, but just know that if you're feeling past burnout, we definitely want you to find somebody who can help you.
Mm-hmm.
And it also says it affects different people differently. So don't feel guilty if your experience is not the same as somebody else's. But this article further goes into what burnout is not. Okay, yes, and I love this too. It is not a medical diagnosis or illness, but it is a factor influencing health. Burnout is not complaining. Burnout is not a reflection of entitlement, millennial culture, laziness, or an erosion of standards. It is not depression or a normal response to a stressful workplace, although there can be overlap. It is not a trivial problem. It has an immense human cost to the 1 million American physicians and massive financial cost as well that's impacting our society. But my favorite, because everybody's going to feel this one. Burnout cannot be solved simply through more meditation, yoga, and free ice cream or a positive attitude. And I love that, because who hasn't, like, in the middle of COVID, it was like, gosh, you've been working so hard. Here's some pizza. And you're like, gosh, we've been working so hard and traumatized. Like, where's the psychiatric help? Like, you know, it feels like there's a disconnect. And I also read an interesting quote that was like, yoga won't save you from a burning building, So if you're actually really, truly burned out and at that kind of rock bottom space, yoga is a lovely thing to do. And it might help you cope, but it's not a solution. And I think when we hear those things, it really adds to the failure. Because you're like, I'm doing yoga, I'm drinking my water, I'm meditating. Why am I still burned out? There must be something wrong with me. And I think those strategies are designed to avoid changing the systems that are causing burnout, but that's a whole nother probably podcast episode.
Which we'll have to we'll bring you back on for that, because that's definitely like a whole other layer to this.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. So, now that I think more about this half-baked thought that's been brewing in my head, it may be almost a little more on that systemic side of things. But I was in a conversation this spring, so it was a hot minute ago, where the conversation came up about burnout. And there was a person who is like been far removed from clinical practice for a really long time. But their response to this, their fix was like, people just need to develop more resiliency. And I didn't have the words or even like the brain power to respond to that. But I knew it felt so off. Like, it felt so far from where we needed to go, but it was just like, there was still a part of me that was like, am I just not resilient enough? Like, is it a resiliency problem? Like, am I just not strong? But hearing you read that definition from that article, which we will post, very much kind of recenters it of like, this is not a failure on my part. This is not a failure on your part. That's not why we're here today.
I mean, I think resiliency efforts are great. And they help us in many ways. But most people I find that are burned out are actually quite resilient because they've made it as far as they have. And saying you need to be more resilient is another way of adding shame and making it feel like it's your fault. Because again, there must be something wrong with you. And burnout, I think, gets worse when people have a lack of control. And if they're doing all of these things that they can control and it's still not working, then that can be really upsetting. So there are lots of different ways to combat burnout. But in jobs, it's very hard because the root source of the job problem is generally not the individual. And it's not necessarily the employer either, right? Like, think about COVID. Is that my employer's fault that we had to go through this horrific pandemic?
Right.
No. And we all had to fail forward together there. Could have been managed better, probably on everyone's part, but hindsight's 2020. So I think developing resiliency is great. It's a great skill to have. I try to build resiliency in myself, growth mindset, help try to do that for my kids. But yeah, I mean, trauma is also a really good way to get resilient, but I wouldn't recommend it.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Burnout is crazy. The other thing that I've noticed, and I found myself being guilty of this, is comparing to other people's situation. Yeah. I was at a keynote speaking thing or event for an evidence-based thing, and it was mostly for students, and I was there as part of my fellowship, and I was listening, and the keynote was great. It was like super inspiring, and this was like we were kind of deep in the pandemic, but sort of edging out of it to the point where we could gather with masks and things.
Yeah.
And one of the students raised their hand and said, I don't know how you expect us to do any of this. We're already burned out. And in my mind, I thought to myself, you're burned out? Seriously?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that you had to sit behind a computer and learn while the rest of us were proning people. And it was the most horrifying thought to me later because I was like, wow, boy, are you burned out? Because you are literally discounting someone else's experience.
Yeah.
And their feelings that are keeping them from participating in their life because you want to think that you had it worse. I had it different. But again, that's like that comparison, that like shaming other people for their experience. Like, so I don't do that anymore. So also don't compare yourself to someone else. Mm-hmm. If you're like, well, I didn't work on the front lines of COVID, I don't understand why I'm so burned out after that. Stop. It was like hard for everybody. If you, one of your coworkers is like thrilled to come to work every day and do the same job that you do, and you feel like you can't cope with it anymore, don't compare yourself to them. There are so many factors that go into it. And that was for me, like, that was a little bit of a wake up call for me, that I was behaving that way. I couldn't believe it.
So and I'm embarrassed to even say it. Right. Let me follow up on that with you. So at the time when this was happening, did you identify that you were experiencing burnout? Like, was that a conscious awareness, or was that something that you were discovering?
I think it was partly a conscious awareness because I was realizing how resentful I was. Like, I had all of this resentment for people that I felt like got to play it safe during the pandemic, or people who didn't have to homeschool their kids and work, or people who didn't lose anyone from COVID. Like, just, and everybody had that to a certain extent. And I worked with COVID patients. I worked in the emergency department. Was I part of our primary COVID team? No. So those people were probably looking at me feeling the same way, like, what did you do? You know, so I think it's just that comparison is the thief of joy. And resentment really, like, can make all of this so much worse, no matter why you're resenting someone else. So that to me was like a huge red flag. Like, you are not okay. Just not okay.
Yeah. What are some other, I don't want to say signs and symptoms because that makes it sound like super clinical here. Like, we're not taking a medical history. But what are maybe some indicators that someone is experiencing burnout? Because something you mentioned previously, Rebekah, I didn't realize that I was burnt out until it came to an absolute head. Like, I was rock bottom and I was like, oh my God, I think I'm burnt out. Not like, oh, I've been burned out for a while.
Yeah. And like, denial's a coping mechanism too. I'm just tired. I don't know why I've been so impatient lately. I just like, I don't know what's with these patients. But it's obviously their fault they're not getting better. They must not be doing what I'm telling them to. Everything my boss says is ridiculous. Like, these things, being that person who's always negative, that can't see a future path forward, that like is detracting from everything. This is the wrong way. I have talked to a lot of people who are like, I dread going to work. And for me, there was a moment at a different job where I was sitting in the parking lot, and I would get to work 30 minutes early because I knew it would take me that long to convince myself to get out of the car and walk into the building.
Yeah.
Red flag. Nightmares, red flag. Like, not doing things that make you like feel good. I find for me, it's like being impatient with my family. It's being impatient with my patients. It's giving into those, like, that lack of curiosity. It's going through the motions. It's apathy. It's resentment. It's like, some people feel physically ill, but there aren't really any reasons for that, or they start finding themselves being sick more and more often. It's all of those things. And I think the other people that I think are burned out, and right, I'm not actually like a clinical burnout expert, but the people that are like, I need to leave the field. I've tried every clinical setting. Don't tell me to try a different setting. I've already done that. Is it that they really hate physical therapy? Maybe. Is it that they need something different? Maybe. Is it that they're burned out? Probably. And that they haven't managed that anywhere they've gone. So that burnout goes with them. And if we can't fix our mindset and the root causes of our burnout, then it's not going to get better. And I talk to people about this a lot. They're like, well, I'm burned out, so I'm going to do a Con Ed course to get me excited about things again. And I'm like, great. Now you're burned out and you can dry needle. That's so great. It doesn't fix anything.
Right.
So I don't know. And I think sometimes one of the best fixes is to be around people who are not burned out and who are still excited about what they're doing, and to kind of feed on that excitement. But I find that can kind of backfire for people sometimes too. where they're like, how come they're excited about this and I'm not?
Yeah.
So I think it's when you're in that situation where no matter what you're trying and the burnout's not improving, it's usually due to a lack of control or a perceived lack of control over the situation.
Okay.
In my experience.
Yeah. So in your experience then, if we're in a situation where like I am burned out and I'm not feeling in control, like, then what? I've identified this, but like, what the heck do we do about it? Like, is there something we can do about it? Because for me, I took a very drastic and not logical approach to fixing my burnout, which is I left a job. And then kind of like the dry needling example you just gave, I left my job. And so I was no longer a practicing physical therapist for a year, but I was still burnt out. Like, I didn't fix the issue.
Yeah, and I know this is like, everybody says this, and if you Google burnout, people are like, well, focus on your wellness. I mean, that's step number one.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk to residents about this a lot because, especially emergency department residents, like their life is really hard.
Oh
I talk to them about what I call the wellness wheel, the 5 areas of wellness: sleep, hydration, nutrition, stress management, and exercise. And I ask them to rate it on a 0 to 5 scale. If all of your wheel spokes are not balanced, the wheel doesn't turn very well.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a thing you can control. If you can rate that every day or over the course of a week, and at the beginning of the week being like, okay, like my sleep last week was a 0. I've really got to focus there. Even if I can get everything to a 3, the wheel will still turn, right? So, I mean, I think that's always step number 1. Am I managing my wellness? And sometimes people feel too burned out to do that, but that's step number 1, especially because if it's gotten out of hand enough where you might be abusing substances or not sleeping or like just stopped exercising because you feel exhausted all the time, you'll forget what feeling well feels like. And if you forget what feeling well feels like, you don't notice that you really don't feel well. Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's step number 1, and you can do your best to control all of those things. Step number 2 for me is looking at the situation that's causing the burnout. Is it your job? Is it your relationships? And today we're talking about physical therapy practice, right? So if at your job you're burned out, can you identify like why that is that you feel that way? And is it like a loss of control? What within your professional journey can you control? And so that's when I started talking to people about professional development planning and how they can start taking control over their career and moving things in a direction that feels rewarding, positive, and gets them back to that place where they want to be.
We chatted about this earlier this fall. And when you first, genuinely, Rebekah, when you first said professional development, I was like, here we go. Like I had an internal eye roll because I was like, this sounds like a clinical ladder. Like I've been in, like, wow, what good could this do? But you walked me through your professional development, like that you did this exercise yourself. And you were so gracious and you're like, I did this and these were the things that I wanted to do. And you talked me through like step by step of like, I sat down and did this and I figured out that this was in line, and I started on this thing over here. And then I realized I didn't actually like it. And so I stopped. And that was so mind-blowing to me, Rebekah, of just like the ability and the option to no longer pursue something that I no longer enjoyed was like a revelation, which sounds so silly, but it genuinely was like, I did not know that was an option. I could do that. I could stop doing something if I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, and I think especially if you've gone all the way to get your doctorate in physical therapy, like you finish stuff. I think a lot of us like are overachievers, hyperachievers, feel bad if we don't finish things. Or we're doing them because we think we should.
Yes.
And not because we want to, or it's in line with who we are. And that brings me back to like, you end up with all these certifications to try and make your burnout better because you think that's the thing that you should do next. So for me, it was like really, truly like getting back in touch with where my career had been, what I really liked about it, what I didn't like about it, where I wanted to be in 1 year, where I wanted to be in 5 years, where I wanted to be in 10 years, because some people are like, I can't imagine doing this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Great. Stop imagining that and let's create the future you want to live into and start working on that. Because the last thing I want you to do is wake up 5 years from now, not recognize yourself, not recognize where you're at, and be like, I've just lost 5 more years of my life sleepwalking through my career. So I think professional development planning also helps those PTs who are like, I'm not sure I really want to be a PT. Because it can help you figure that out. But you can't just do it like a clinical ladder. Because if you do it like a clinical ladder, you're thinking inside the matrix.
Yep.
So you have to really do it without limit. You have to think, if I could do anything, be anything, what would it be? What am I excited about? What would I really want to do if I could do anything? Whether in the field, outside of the field. And I encourage people to bring their personal life into this too. Otherwise, it's like an unrealistic discharge plan.
Yep.
You know, like I'm not moving to Antarctica tomorrow to do soil samples. I have 3 kids and a life here that I'm not just going to walk away from. So I have to think about like, how does my life work flow come together? And then how can I make my career support that? And how can my career be part of my life and not feel like work? So I don't know. It's exciting. And I've had people who, everybody's like, oh, professional development planning. And I get it. I totally get it. But once you actually do that work and you're excited and you're like, I've got this new mission, it's reinvigorating. And I've had people who are like at the very end of their career and they're like, I feel like I have some purpose. And I'm like, you do, because now you can finish your career the way you want to.
Yeah.
And you can end your career feeling like great about it, instead of being like, God, I had to suffer through the last 5 years of my career. If I had to do all over again, I would never do that. Yeah. I want you to be that person. I want you to be that person that when somebody asks you at a party what you do, you can't wait to tell them about it. And maybe you end up dry needling.
Which is
or maybe
totally
you end
cool.
up being a lymphedema specialist, or maybe you end up in an area of PT that doesn't exist yet. Or maybe you like find your like patient population that you didn't even know was out there. Or maybe you find a way to be a physical therapist who works with social justice issues. I mean, there's so much we can do. And maybe you stop being a physical therapist, which is also okay. But I would argue that being a physical therapy is that which a physical therapist does. So no matter where you go, no matter what you do, you'll still be doing it as a physical therapist. You'll still be bringing that lens, that mindset, that compassion, that like whole way we look at things, that function-based, that life-based lens to whatever you do. And whatever area you end up in, if you bring that to it, it's going to be better for it. We just got to figure out what it is you want to do and help you get to it.
I'm not going to cry on this podcast, but
you
I'm
could.
getting real
It'd
close.
Be okay.
I could. It's my own podcast. I could. But what you said, Rebekah, it hit me so hard of like, you're still a physical therapist. Because I genuinely, when I left my job and I didn't practice for a year, I was like, can I call myself a PT? Like,
100%.
Am I really a physical therapist? I'm not actually like treating patients. And that, I felt that very deeply.
I had that conversation with my daughter, right? Because I'm on medical leave right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing some teaching and things like this. And she's like, Mommy, you need to be physical therapying people because that's your job. You're a physical therapist. You should be physical therapisting. And I said, honey, I'm a physical therapist no matter what I'm doing.
Still am.
And this is still a way that I'm contributing to the world as a physical therapist. Mm-hmm. So we need you, no matter what you decide to do. And I want you to find your way out before you get burned all the way to the ground.
So this brings up a question I hadn't prepared you for, but I do think it warrants asking. So if I'm like, we have a listener right now who is burned out.
So burned out.
What is the problem with not fixing it? Like, Like, because one of the things that I felt like, because I had tunnel vision and it felt like I was in a tunnel, but with a wall that I couldn't break through. And like, all I could do is see exactly what was right in front of me. Like, there was no future. It was just like, there is a barrier. And that's just kind of where I thought I was going to exist forever. So let's say that there's a listener out there right now who's like, this is where I'm at. I feel like I'm burned out, but like maybe this is just how it's supposed to be. Like, what is the danger or what is the problem with not addressing burnout?
So I worked with a nurse who was really burned out, and he went on a 1-month vacation. And I thought, he's going to feel so restored when he comes back. Like wine tours in Italy, doing yoga, having wine tasting, eating pizza, like all of that. And he came back to work and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're back. He's like, I'm leaving the profession. I said, why? We really need you. Like, great emergency nurses are so critical.
Oh my gosh.
He said, I am so burned out, I'm going to hurt someone. I won't mean to. I won't intend to. But I'm so burned out that I'm negligent and I'm apathetic.
Wow.
And if I don't leave now, I will hurt someone. And it'll probably be a patient or it will be myself, but I am not going to make it through this. And so I have to leave. I waited too long and I cannot continue. So when I heard that, I thought, yeah, our society posts so much like value on sucking it up and gritting it out and being tough and, I guess you're just not resilient enough. You didn't manage your burnout well enough. You didn't yoga enough. But that attitude leads us to people who are leaving healthcare because they're afraid they're going to hurt someone. They've gone so far past burnout that they're like depersonalizing people. They don't have their why anymore. And not only do they not have their why, they don't care. And they can't care. And so I want every physical therapist who wants to stay in this profession to find a way to be here, which is why I do this. Like I said, I'm not a burnout expert. I don't do research in this area. I just found something that helps a lot of people and I want to share about it. And even if the only thing you take from me is that burnout is not your fault, I hope that makes your day tomorrow a little bit easier. But that's the consequence. Don't get me wrong, I'd still like to try a 1-month trip to Italy to see if it would help, but
genuinely, how brave of that nurse to recognize that. Like, it's so unfortunate that it got to that point where he was like, I'm done. And I wish there had been a way to keep him in, because I do feel like he obviously like meant a great deal to the team. But it does strike me that that was a brave decision. And I wish he didn't have to make that decision.
It was so brave. And his professionalism and humanity and his oath as a nurse was there. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He got into nursing to take care of people. And when he realized he couldn't do that anymore, he stepped aside. I mean, I don't think there's anything braver than that. He let go of the things he worked so hard for so that he didn't hurt anyone else. And I know he's doing great now. But I feel like we as a society failed him.
Totally.
He didn't fail us.
Yes. Like, you've even told me that example before, Rebekah, and it's still like it just...
Yeah. And a lot of people can't leave. They can't afford to leave. They are afraid to leave. They feel too guilty to leave.
Mm-hmm.
I'm listening to a book right now called Shock. And it's by a physician who almost bled to death from a medical diagnosis and was in the ICU, open abdomen, like the whole thing. This whole process. Made it through her whole recovery, and then they found tumors in her liver. They had to kind of start all over again. And the lessons she learned from being on the patient side of all of these encounters, what she could hear that she never thought patients could hear, how patients or how physicians spoke to her, even though she was a physician, the way that she was treated. And I hear so many of these examples in the book, and I'm like, okay, I need to rethink this, and this in my own practice. But also like, wow, are we training people to behave that way? Or are they so burned out they don't have another way to be?
Ooh.
And if that's who's like still in the field, then people are going to lose their trust in medicine, which I think is happening to a certain extent.
I do think that's happening.
They're going to be reticent to get help. And when our patients are burned out and in despair, and our providers are burned out in despair, where does that leave us for a path forward? And then we put that all on the next generation coming up, right? Like, oh, you're a bright, new, shiny physical therapist. You're disposable. We've burnt this pack out. Let's get them to retire and we'll just start over again, but not learn anything, not change anything.
Yeah.
So
it's so much bigger than just one physical therapist leaving for like a non-clinical job, which again, like Rebekah mentioned previously, if you know that your path is in a non-clinical job, then pursue that. But it is really interesting to be a part of those forums and see just like how many people are leaving. And, you know, it gives me pause now thinking that those are probably some really good clinicians.
Well, yeah. And then I see a lot of those comments too that are like, the money will never be worth it. Or reimbursement's not worth it. And this is a scam, all of this. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think anybody got into this for the money, but I think that's an excuse we use to leave.
Yeah.
I'm not saying what we get paid. I'm not making any commentary about that. I think there's so much room for improvement.
Agreed.
But it's more than that.
Right.
It's more than that. So there's burnout and insufficient pay, which feels like a combination that you're able to walk away from. But if you're not burned out and you're not making enough money, usually you can find a way, right? Like, but so there isn't one problem. It's so multifaceted. So you really have to think about what is the problem for you and how do we address it for you? And if these issues can't be addressed because they're systemic, they're societal, they're in your facility, they're your unethical leadership, whatever the case may be, what can you control? And that's your own career trajectory.
So, like we mentioned previously, Rebekah, we're going to have to leave the systemic issues for another episode because that could be a whole podcast in itself if I had to take
I'm sure there's like whole books about that.
I mean, right? Someone probably already has a podcast about this and I just haven't found it yet.
Same.
When it comes to managing, like, I'm listening right now and I know like I'm headed down a path. I am becoming a physical therapist that I don't recognize anymore and I don't like. And I don't want to be that PT anymore. Like, I want to be the excited, passionate person who got into this in the first place and was like, this sounds really cool. I think I want to be a part of it. What can they be doing to proactively manage this? Or like, if we're already in burnout, like, how can we take the steps towards like doing this professional development and, you know, prioritizing our wellness wheel here?
I mean, I think the first step is to acknowledge that you're burned out. Acknowledge that it's not your fault, but acknowledge that no one is coming to save you. Because I think that's the other thing is we keep waiting for somebody to fix it.
Ooh.
If they would just this, I wouldn't be so burned out. If I just made more money, I wouldn't be so burned out. If the hours were better, if I saw fewer patients, like all of that. If leadership would just. And I think that's how we get further into the hole, waiting for someone to save us. So the approach that I've taken, which obviously is not going to work for everybody, is to control what I can control.
Yeah.
I can control my own health and well-being to a certain extent. I'll do everything that I can to control that. And then I'm going to decide what factors about my career I can control, what direction I want it to go, what is meaningful to me. And then I have to be the one to take action. So the way that I recommend people do that is through a structured professional development planning. And you can do that on your own. You can do that with a coach. You can do it with a mentor. But you have to acknowledge so many things. And professional development planning is a cycle. It's not something you do one time and you're done.
Yeah.
It is a repeated reflection. So the first step is really assessment. Where have I been? Where am I now? What are my strengths? What are my deficits? What am I happy about? What am I unhappy about? Why did I get into this profession in the first place? The good, bad, and the ugly. What am I most proud of? Where do I feel the least effective? What bothers me most about my current situation? And getting all of that out. And then the next step is to brainstorm, who do I want to be? What do I want to do more of? What do I think would fix this problem for me? Because you can't wait for somebody else to fix it for you, like I said. And so what could I do to make a change in my life so that I'm not burned out? And the problem I feel like is this is where people get stuck. They can't see a way out, which is part of the problem with the burnout. It's like being trapped in a burning building, right? Like we're panicking. We can't see there's a window over there. All we can see is that the door is blocked.
Right.
So really brainstorming without limit, without shame, with eagerness, with excitement, with like imagining you could have it all. What does that look like? And then this is the most important part. And I got this from an occupational therapist because God bless them. They look at things so much more nuanced than we do. I always say PT is a sledgehammer. OT is the chisel. They're doing the shaping. We are blunt instruments that are just getting after it.
So, I love that so much.
Yeah. And what we realized was missing was a vision. And I know if you're like me, you're like, oh, that sounds like so squishy and touchy-feely, and I am not doing that. But what that is the most important part because that is your touchstone, and that is how you decide how to move forward. Once you figure out what your vision for yourself and your life are, what components are critical to you, they're deal breakers. You can't rule them. You can rule these things out, but you have to rule all of this in. That's how you know every time you make a decision, I'm going to say yes, I'm going to say no, based on that touchstone. I'm going to look back at that and I'm going to remember, is this going to move me closer to who I want to be? Or is this going to move me further away from who I want to be? And then you say yes and no accordingly. And then after you've figured out who that person is, that person that you don't recognize anymore, that person that you wanted to be, that person that you never thought you'd be. Like, I never thought I'd work in the emergency department. I never thought I would do any of the things that I'm doing right now. So it may be that you don't even know where your future is going to take you. And that's kind of cool. So once you get that figured out, then you make your plan. This is who I want to be. And it can be abstract. It can be bullet points. It can be something that looks like it should be on a website. It can be whatever is meaningful to you. These are your like non-negotiables. Now, how do I make a career from that? Here's my 1-year goal. Here's my 5-year goal. If I'm not here in 10 years, I'm going to be upset. And then you work backwards. How do I get from where I am now to this point? And you can't sit from a mindset of, I'll never be able to do that where I work. They'll never let me. No, this is what you can control. I will work backwards from here to there, and I will get myself here. And then you figure out what you need to do that. And you make your resources list. I need mentoring. I need training. I do need that dry needling class.
I do need to get dry needle certified.
Like, what is it that you need? I need time. I need money. I need a scholarship. I need a babysitter. I need my spouse to buy into this. I need to start my own business. Like, you will make that list of resources. And then you just have to go and do the work. That's the easy part. I will tell you, the easy part is the goal setting. We're physical therapists. We know what SMART goals are. What's the R stand for?
Realistic.
Relevant.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
These goals have to be relevant to your vision. Otherwise, they're meaningless. So relevant is the most key component here. Realistic is also important, right? But relevant is so key. I don't care if you're toiling away to something unrealistic if it makes you happy. But if it's relevant to you, that's what matters. So the hardest part is setting your vision and your intention and deciding who you are. And that's where people get stuck. And they stop doing the work. So if you can truly like put your all into that piece, the planning your goals, to figuring out what you need, all of a sudden it's like crystal clear. And then you can move forward to that. And then you keep doing that. You start over again and you cycle. I try to review my plan every month. And it's time. It's time again for me to look at it. And even if I haven't looked at it for a whole month, I'll look at it and I'll be like, wow, I got a lot more of this done than I thought I would. I'm surprised because my intention has been there.
Yeah.
Because my intention is clear and it aligns with my vision. And it's fun.
You mentioned something I want to pull back that was really profound, which was, if in 10 years I'm not here, I'm going to be upset. Mm-hmm. And I think that has a way of almost pulling you out of the present, which again, very much like when I was in the throes of burnout, it was like I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me.
Yeah.
But pulling out and looking like almost up and over that wall.
Yes.
Of if I'm not here in 10 years, I'm going to be upset.
Or if I'm still here in 10 years, I'm going to be upset.
Right. That too.
So I had somebody that I was working with that was like about to have a baby. And she started crying and she was like, I can't see a year from now. I can't see 3 years from now. I can kind of see what I would like to be doing in 5 years. But I can't even wrap my head around what a 1-year goal would look like for me. I know what I want my life to look like. But right now, I have a 2-year-old and I'm about to have a baby. And I'm just so distressed. So I was like, great, let's focus on that 5-year plan and set some intentions around that. And then your 1-year goal is to just show up to as many days of work as you can. Because when you have 2 small children, God bless it. If you can just get to work, that's great. Or you decide if working for the next year is not in the cards. And that's why you also have to bring your personal life into this professional development planning so that it really supports your actual life. People talk about work-life balance. It turns out they're the same thing. It's all your life. And there is no balance. There has to be flow. Life, work, flow. I mean, if I could take out the word work and just call it life flow, I would do that, but then nobody ever knows what I'm talking about. But your life should be something that includes your work. And your work should be something that enhances your life. So you have to look at the whole picture, which is why I encourage people to do this without thinking about where they work or what they're doing now, but who they want to be and what would it look like if they were free to have all of it. And then how do you get there?
Okay, so I want to do this with you, Rebekah.
Yeah.
And I know there's people listening who are thinking the same thing. How can they go through this process potentially with you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So one thing coming, there's going to be a 2-hour webinar on my website about how to do this. So if you want to hear like all of the nitty gritty about the process that I've like been refining for the last couple of years, it includes like definitions around mentoring training, resources, like all of those things that will be available. Part of the reason that process is so helpful is it gives you step-by-step how to use the professional development planning template that I created and how to use the right words to get what you need. So if you are going to go into your boss and you're like, hey, I made this professional development planning plan. I want to share that with you. I need these things to reach my goals. Your boss is going to be like, thank goodness, because I have no idea how to help you with your burnout. But if I can support you in these ways, that's great. If you've given me a roadmap to help support you and make you successful, I'm here for it. Or at least they should, right? Like ideally.
Right.
And if they can't, then that also helps you realize that maybe this is not the right space to be. So that I think is one way to get started. Then I also do offer private professional development coaching. If you're like, there's no way I'm going to do this on my own. I can't do it. I can't see a future. I can't get through this. I will help you. And one of the ways that I help people is that I let you start talking about all those things. And I listen. Just listen for who you are and for what matters to you. And what I usually do is I just write down the things that keep coming out in different ways.
Yeah.
And usually it's just as simple as a sticky note. And then I can hand that back to you. And you can see who you are reflected back to you. that you might not have seen that person in a long time. And it can be really powerful for people to see themselves reflected through someone else's listening of them. And it can feel really good and like a place to start. And then I can also help you get through that plan, help you make sure you get a touchstone that feels authentic to you. And I can like help you make sure you get that plan done and coach you through that and give you that accountability. And if you're like, I'm willing to pay for accountability, I'm here for that. It is a hard thing to do by yourself.
Yeah.
And I can help coach you in all the right directions. So you can definitely reach out to me on my website, www.theoncopT.com. Just do a contact me is on there. I'm happy to help you with that. And then we will have this 2-hour webinar available to you probably before this podcast airs. So it should be available now. I'm going to set that future intention.
Oh, I like that. Real clear on that vision, y'all. She knows exactly what she's going for. This is and so needed.
What I'm not going for.
Where can people, we obviously talked about the website. Where can people connect with and follow you on social media?
Instagram at the EDDPT, Facebook, same thing, Twitter, same thing. Definitely here to connect with you. I'm going to be posting more content about burnout because I feel like particularly people who work in the emergency department have a lot of secondary trauma, as I know oncology PTs do as well, which is another risk factor for burnout. And like I said, one of my missions in this world is to have as many physical therapists like happy, thriving, and transforming society the way that only we can. But we have to take care of ourselves and we have to save ourselves, right? So I think that's why it's important to me. It's part of my touchstone. It's like guidance counseling for PTs.
I didn't know I needed this conversation until we had this conversation, Rebekah. Like, this was perfect. And I'm really glad you stopped me at the beginning of the episode and like set the intention for this episode because it was really powerful. And I'm really, really excited to share this.
So we're not having New Year, New You, but we are having the year where we figure out who we are and then we're going to live into that. And I hope you'll consider maybe sharing your vision for your career with everybody as part of this podcast. I'm going to challenge you to do that.
A little behind the scenes, my husband and I are planning a like end of year kind of personal but also like business retreat thing, and I am going to have us do this exercise, like the both of us, and I will come back and I will like share what I have filled out in mine, because I think that would be a really powerful way of like, that is accountability for me to say that right now and say that I'm going to show up and do that. So y'all, you heard it here. I'm going to make it happen and I'm going to show back up here and I'm going to share with you what I have figured out.
And then we will watch you like live that for the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years.
Rebekah, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and talk about this. I know that this is going to be a favorite episode easily. And I'm really, really glad that I got to sit here and have this conversation, but that others get to experience this. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.